Hermes was a Jew. In fact, he was a particularly famous Jew. He was the founder of the Jewish religious system. He received a great revelation on top of a mountain. He was a legislator of laws, deviser of religious ceremonies, founder of a great state. That's because Hermes was Moses, or at least that's what one ancient Jew believed. That Jew was Artapanus, a man whose name reflects a time when Persians held sway over Jews in Egypt. The date of Artapanus is insecure. He lived a considerable time before Christianity emerged, yet we can only supply him with a general date range. Artapanus lived sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, about 200 years before Jesus. We know where Artapanus lived. He lived in Egypt, and probably in the great city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, west of the great Nile Delta. Artapanus was Hellenized. This means he could speak and write in Greek. It also means that he had adapted the unwritten codes and modes of Greek thought. He was part and parcel of Greek culture, and specifically the cultural fusion that characterized Alexandria. Alexandria was a place where native Egyptians, Jews, and Greeks met on a daily basis. It was a place where Greek intellectuals tried to understand their culturally diverse world in their own terms. Jews living in Alexandria were proud of their native Jewish heritage, but they had something to prove to their Greek neighbors. First and foremost, they tried to prove that they were not their cultural inferiors. They could speak Greek with just as much refinement, write it just as proficiently, make cultural references just as adroitly, cite poets just as skillfully, and they could become poets themselves. Artapanus was not a poet, but a historian of sorts. There were several different kinds of history in the ancient world, as in the modern world. Artapanus wrote what might be called popular history. Today, this kind of history looks more like novel writing. Popular historians often do not cite their sources or give alternative accounts. They don't distinguish fact from interpretation. They replace arguments based on evidence with strong assertion. They persuade people not by strict logic, but by vivid storytelling. The more vivid the story, the more memorable it is. The more memorable, the more repeated. The more repeated, the more widespread. The more widespread, the more likely it is to be accepted as true at a popular level. Artapanus' history is an argument in story form for the superiority of Jewish culture. Artapanus writes with all the feistiness of a man who was part of a minority subculture trying to prove himself to a cultural elite. Artapanus rewrote history in an attempt to revise cultural memory. He traced back the cultural goods of Egypt and Greece to Jewish cultural heroes. His work is fiction in popular historical form. Learned Greeks and Egyptians would probably have rejected it out of hand. A Roman writer during the time of Jesus, named Alexander Polyhistor, summarized Artapanus' work. Sections of Polyhistor's work were in turn copied out by a 4th century church historian. By this tortuous track, 3 fragments of Artapanus are preserved today. Artapanus said that Moses was Hermes, or rather that Hermes was Moses. This identification may seem strange, but there is something even more strange. Artapanus names all Jews after Hermes. He says that the apparently original name of the Jews was Hermute. This bizarre name may have been intended to be the Jews' Egyptian name. Where exactly it comes from is anybody's guess. Perhaps the Jews were named Hermeut after Moses Hermes. In the context of Artapanus' fragments, however, the name seems to go back to more ancient times. Whatever the origin of the name, the Greeks translated it as Judai, from which comes the English Jews or Judeans. So Hermes was actually Moses. Now, mind you, Artapanus was not saying that Moses was a Greco-Egyptian god. Moses was a man, though the Egyptians later deified him. In other words, Artapanus accepted the euhemerized version of Hermes, the idea that he was originally a man, later made into a god. The euhemerized Hermes made possible the Jewish version of Hermes as Moses. Artapanus did not, in his own mind, identify a man with God. He rather fused the stories of two deified men. Both lived in ancient history. Both were later viewed as gods by their constituents. Yet both were originally men, great men to be sure, and men who could be called divine. Artapanus leaves it up to the reader to find out why Moses and Hermes are the same man. It comes as a bold assertion, and the detective work is up to us. There's an initial obvious parallel. Hermes Tot was the lord of Heka, or magic. Moses, as it turns out, was a well-known magician. He had a staff, which looked very much like a wand, and he could turn his staff into a snake, make water into blood, ash into gnats, and so on. Yet Artapanus, it seems, did not identify Moses and the Egyptian Hermes because they were both great magicians, nor does Artapanus connect Moses and Hermes because both taught astrology. By the 2nd century BCE, the Egyptian Hermes was widely viewed as the great teacher of astrology. Indeed, some of the first Hermetic literature, which arose in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, was astrological in nature. It was Hermes who taught Pharaoh Nekepso and his priest Pedosiris how to read the stars as signs. In fact, there was a chain of learning. Hermes taught Asclepius and Anubis, who in turn taught Pedosiris and Nekepso. These two Egyptians were the reputed authors of many astrological treatises in antiquity. Artapanus revises this picture. He says that it was Abraham, not Hermes, who taught Pharaoh astrology, and this Pharaoh was not a recent Pharaoh like Nekepso. Rather, he was one of the most ancient pharaohs. This Pharaoh was named Pharatotes. This is probably a made-up name that seems to mean nothing more than Pharaoh Tot. In effect, what Artapanus says, ever so slyly, is that Abraham taught astrology to Tot. Hermes Tot was not the original astrologer then. The original astrologer was Abraham. Tot was completely dependent upon a Jew to learn astrology. In fact, the father of the Jews. Artapanus was eager to make Abraham the archetypal astrologer because in Hellenistic Egypt astrology was highly valued, cultural knowledge. Logically, Artapanus attempted to undercut the Egyptian claim to be the originators of this knowledge. It turns out that both Artapanus and the Egyptians were wrong. Hellenistic astrology seems to owe most of its learning to Babylon. Both Greeks and Egyptians adapted Babylonian astrology in their own distinctive ways. Artapanus says that Moses was deified not by Jews, but by Egyptians, and specifically by Egyptian priests. Moses was called Hermes for the same reason that Hermes was called Hermes. The name came from hermeneia, the art of interpretation. Moses invented hieroglyphs, taught them, and explained their meaning. In short, Moses performed hermeneia. Therefore, he was called Hermes. The whole fiction of a man deified for inventing literature is quintessentially Greek. Artapanus is totally entranced by the spell of Hellenistic thinking, and yet he remains a loyal Jew. Herein is an essential point. It's not really the Egyptians who deify Moses. The Egyptians never had a motive to deify a Jew. They would have never identified him with their god Thoth. No, it was a Jew who deified Moses. It was Artapanus himself. How did he do it? He told a story. It was a Greek story through and through, but told by a Jew to advance the cause of Jews and to poke fun at Egyptians. Artapanus' emphasis is very much on Moses, the cultural hero. the inventor, the city builder, the legislator, the warrior. These are the traits that made Moses and Hermes alike. A culture hero is a man who bestows tremendous benefits upon society. The specific benefits that Moses bestowed on Egypt were incredible, both in the sense of being wondrous and in the sense of being, frankly, hard to believe. For instance, Artapanus says that Moses Hermes was the inventor of ships. Even Diodorus of Sicily did not credit Hermes Tot with this invention. If Moses Hermes did invent seafaring, he even beat Jason and the Argonauts to the punch. Moses also invented machines for lifting and fitting stones. This was no mean feat, for it was this invention that made the pyramids possible. How did the Egyptians haul 20-ton blocks to the top of a 10-story pyramid? The feat is so out of this world that some have ascribed it to aliens. But lo, it was a Jew who made these world wonders a reality. The greatest accomplishment of Hermes Moses was to invent philosophy. Nowadays, everyone thinks that the Greeks invented philosophy. But this is not what the Egyptians, in addition to many learned Greeks, believed. The Egyptians prided themselves on being the oldest culture of the Mediterranean. The oldest culture had the most ancient wisdom. An Egyptian priest possessed both books and stone inscriptions to prove that their wisdom stretched back thousands of years before Greek and Jewish civilization. A culture hero is also a founder figure. According to Artapanus, Moses was the founder not just of an individual city, he was the architect of the entire Egyptian state. He divided it into 36 regions called nomes. Before this institution, Egypt was a chaos of rival pharaohs, appointed and deposed by a fluctuating mob. Hermes Moses was not the pharaoh, but as the adopted son of the queen, he functioned as vizier, exactly the role that Tot played for the first pharaoh, Amon-Ra. But the curveball is yet to come. The blueprint of Egyptian religion, Artapanus says, was drawn up by a Jew. In the ancient world, the founder of a state was the founder of its religion. The state gods were chosen along with the rites and customs that unite a people. The religion that Hermes Moses established in Egypt looked nothing like Judaism. To each of the 36 nomes, Moses assigned a particular god to be worshipped. These gods were the animal or animal-headed gods familiar from Egyptian art. There were cat gods and crocodile gods, dog-headed gods and hippopotamus gods. There was also an ibis god. Now the ibis is the soul of Tot. Hermes Moses set up and deified his own totem animal. Set over this entire apparatus of Egyptian religion was the supreme pontiff himself, Hermes Moses. He set aside land for the priests. He determined their offices. He gave the priests their writings. This whole story mimics Egyptian tradition, for Egyptian priests traced all temple writings back to Tot. To make Moses the author of these writings was to make a Jew the fountainhead of Egyptian wisdom. The identification of Hermes and Moses was not a playful game concocted by a novelist. It was a political move. It had the power to revise history. Artapanus attempted to subsume all that was good about Egyptian religion and Egypt itself into Judaism, the religion of Moses. But Artapanus danced on a double-edged sword. The figure of Moses did not in fact absorb Hermes. Rather, Hermes swallowed Moses. The first purveyor of universalist monotheism was also the architect of the Egyptian animal cults. The founder of the Jewish state first founded the Egyptian one, and he did so hardly on Jewish terms. Hermes Moses gave laws and letters to the Egyptians, but they looked nothing like Jewish laws. The great liberator of Egypt fought Egypt's battles, established her cities, made possible her pyramids, filled her libraries, and founded her wisdom. With Artapanus, all that was Egypt became Jewish, yet all that Moses accomplished became the glory of Egypt. If Moses was really Hermes, then Judaism is in fact, and at its origin, a Hermetic religion.